folks, and let's jump right into our discussion of Thales and the one under many theme. All right, so I'm going to talk a little bit about one under many here, and then we're going to go on and talk about Thales, the first philosopher for some people. Probably correct to call him the first philosopher, although some people think Pythagoras is, but let's not get into it. All right, here we are. One under many. What does that mean? Well, it's an attempt by philosophers to uncover the oneness concealed behind the plurality of the visible world. Okay, so we'll talk about Thales and how he thinks everything is water. But first, let's talk a little bit about this one under many, or the problem of being and becoming. Those are sort of the same thing. You can imagine being an ancient Greek way back in the day, and you see a cow eat some grass and produce some milk. And so the Greeks look at this and they say, my gosh, the cow combines with the grass and it generates the milk. So the milk must have something in common with both the grass and the cow. And in fact, the grass and the cow probably have something together too. And so what the heck is underneath all of it? What is it that all of these things have in common, right? And so this is the problem of one under many, right? Everything comes into being and then goes out of being. So this is the stuff that we perceive, right? There's a rock in my front yard. My friend Otto, Professor Figueroa, tells me it was made billions of years ago, right? But at some point that rock's going to break down. It's going to boil up in lava. It's going to slowly wear away, right? All things that we observe suffer generation and decay. They come into being and they pass away. That's what we mean by the phrase becoming. It's the world of becoming, the world of things that exist at one point and then do not exist at another point. That includes us. That includes this house, this building, this computer, and this video, right? But as things pass into being and pass out of being, is there something that all of these things have in common? Some kind of underlying structure or some kind of underlying substance? Is there a way that we can explain how all things are one things, or how there's one thing that underlies other things? This is a fundamental question in philosophy. Is there a kind of stuff, a being, a substance underneath all of it, out of which everything else is made, but which itself does not change? This is the quest. And so we will look at a series of philosophers in this module. First, we'll look at Thales, then we'll talk about Anaximander and Anaximenes, and they all pose answers to this question in very specific ways, in special ways that they had not and their ancestors had not before that. I have to introduce one piece of the Greek language. It's the word arche. There just is no other option for me. I have to use this word. I try to avoid Greek as much as possible because I'm terribly poor in it. But this is a word we need to understand. And ancient Greek is very distant to us. And so there's not always a one-to-one relationship between their words and our words. So, for instance, their color words are different than ours. They don't quite map up right. The same thing is true of our concepts. Many of our concepts, as you'll find out in this semester, come from the Greeks. Not all of them, of course, but many do. And so the word arche could be translated into any of these other words. Beginning, origin, a principle, a source, a first principle, a ruling principle, and you can see the root of the word arche in archaeology and archaic. We won't get into that, but you've seen this root elsewhere. All right, so let's talk about Thales. We'll talk about Anaximander and Anaximenes down the line. Let's talk about Thales, who's very, very famous for claiming that everything is water. Right? Okay, so we'll talk about Thales in 4 parts here. The arche is water, some arguments, some stories about him, and then this wild claim that he makes: everything is full of gods. Okay, Thales lives right here in Miletus. You can see in this map that there used to be a lot more land there. It's the water levels have changed, and so we don't see it the same way. But it was a very prosperous trading area. They traded a lot of wool and stuff out of this. So it was a kind of major commercial center. There are interesting reasons why this might be. If you have people making money, they have time to do other things, like think about how all these things might be one thing. And so it's not an accident that in a society where people have time to do more than just struggle to survive, they start developing different kinds of intellectual products, different kinds of cultural products, and so forth. Okay, Thales, when he says that everything is water, what he really means is the arche is water. The ruling principle of the universe is water. The primary stuff of the universe is water. How do we know this? We know this because Aristotle talks about Thales, and this is what he says. Most thought that first principles, arche, in the form of matter, and only these, are the sources of all things, for that of which all things consist, the antecedent from which they have sprung and into which they are finally resolved. Thales, the founder of this sort of philosophy, says that it is water. Okay, so what's Aristotle saying there? He says, look, first principles are really to be understood in terms of the stuff that makes up the universe. That's this first line, the form of matter. And only these things, right? Only these first principles, only water, is the way that we explain that of which all things consist, what everything is made up of. And then this next bit about the antecedent, he says, look, this is how we explain the problem of becoming, that things come into being and then go away. How do we do it? We explain them in terms of the things that make them up. And in this case, for Thales, the things that makes up everything is water. So this should sound silly to you because very clearly my phone doesn't have any water in it. Or it shouldn't anyway. So it does sound silly, and Thales would say it sounds silly to you, but you have to remember that what's most important about this is not whether or not he's right. It's that he's giving reasons for thinking the way that he does. He's not like Hesiod, right? Hesiod kind of strolls in, and he's kind of chill, and he's like, oh, the muses, tell me what's going on, right? Maybe he starts huffing some glue, and Hesiod's like, all the gods were made at the same time, and, right, tell me these things, O Olympian muses, right? Thales goes, we don't need to huff anything. I'm just going to think about this for a second, and I'm going to give you reasons for thinking the way that I do, and that's a revolution. He's not relying on the supernatural to explain the way that things are. He's going to do it with his own mind. He's going to give arguments for thinking the way that he thinks. Now, these arguments are going to be terrible, okay? They're going to be terrible, but they're the first draft of what becomes empirical reasoning and rational thought. So let's take a quick peek. Okay, we know about Thales through Aristotle, and Aristotle writes, because... That's the most important word there. Because he saw that the nourishment of all beings is moist, and that warmth itself is generated from moisture and persists in it, for that from which all things spring is the first principle of them. And getting the idea also from the fact that the germs of all beings are of a moist nature. Germs there probably mean seeds. Right? So the seeds of all things, of all beings, are of a moist nature, while water is the first principle of the nature of what is moist. Okay. What's going on here, right? By the way, as I read these, they may not just roll off the tongue to you. That's because sometimes philosophy is quite dense. And so what I'll do is I'll read the passage, then I'll go back and mention certain parts. But let's just take these one by one. What Thales is doing here is he's offering a conclusion and then a reason for thinking the way that he does. Remember, Hesiod doesn't really have a reason. He just appeals to authority. How do I know this? The muses, right? In other words, the gods are telling me. But revelation might have its problems. Thales wants to try something new, and so he gives an argument. And the argument is, the nourishment of all beings is moist, thus water is a ruling principle of life. This is very insightful. He might notice that animals that eat food, very typically, there's water in the food. And so, because of that, water must have something to do with life. It's crude. it's not something that necessarily we would think is like super insightful, but it is for the time, right? It is unusual. Now he has another argument. This one's worse. Warmth is generated from moisture. It's actually not. Thus, water is a ruling principle of life. Again, terrible argument, right? The premise number 1 doesn't really guarantee the conclusion 2, right? But it's an argument, and that's the first time anybody had done this for the Greeks, right? So this is a big deal. Warmth persists in moisture, kind of. Thus, water is a ruling principle of life. Again, not a good argument, but it's an argument, and that's what's exciting. Germs of all beings are moist, germs meaning seeds. Thus, water is a ruling principle of life. Again, not a great argument, but not awful, and it's tied to empirical understanding. And what's so important is that Thales is going to say, we actually know what the universe is made out of, and we can figure out what the universe is made out of. This is kind of an exciting sort of approach. So it's not that Thales makes good arguments by our standards. It's just that he's trying to make arguments. He thinks that humans don't need to have the truth revealed to them by the gods, like Hesiod did. And so this represents the beginning of a massive cultural shift in thinking for the Greeks. Okay, the stories of Thales. Here we go. I want to just draw your attention to the upper right corner of your screen. You'll notice a small lotus. Remember, the lotus means there's something on this slide that you're about to be tested on with regard to the quiz. And so that will help you narrow down as you're moving through, like, oh, there's a lotus, I got it, okay, all right. So here's Aristotle again. He's talking a story about Thales, right? He's sharing this story. Thales, so the story goes, because of his poverty, was taunted with the uselessness of philosophy. But from his knowledge of astronomy, he had observed while it was still winter that there was going to be a large crop of olives. So he raised a small sum of money and paid round deposits for the whole of the olive presses in Miletus and Chios, which he hired at a low rent, as nobody was running him up. And when the season arrived, there was a sudden demand for a number of presses at the same time, and by letting them out on what terms he liked, he realized a large sum of money, or ducats, or clams, or bones, or whatever you're going to call them. So, this is the story. Somebody makes fun of him. Yeah, philosophy's so great, why don't you have any money, right? Then he observes the skies or something like that, and he says, gosh, it's been a wet winter, so we're going to have a major bumper crop of olives. I'm going to buy the presses ahead of time, right? That's the story. Now, does this really happen? Nah, we don't know, right? We don't have any receipts from it. We just have no way of knowing whether this happened or not. Anybody who was alive at the time is dead thousands of years. Even if he had an olive press, it would have been crumbled to dust by now. There's just no way for us to know, right? But the fact that they were telling this story about Thales tells us a lot about how Aristotle and the Greeks think about Thales. Thales has a way of acquiring knowledge that other people do not have. Otherwise, he wouldn't be making all the cash. He wouldn't be making it rain, right? Thales seems to understand cause and effect better than other people. And Thales doesn't work full-time as a philosopher. He also runs a business. I'm not going to get into that, but it's an interesting point. All right, now, Herodotus, who is an old historian, an ancient Greek historian, who has some cool things to say about the pyramids, but we're not getting into that. Let's get on to our bit. He has a story about Thales and a river, so call this Crimea River or something. When he, and by he we mean Thales, came to the river Halys, he transported his, that's the Greek name for it now, it's actually different today because it's in Turkey. He came to the river Halys, I think that's right. He transported his army across it by the bridges which were there then, as I maintain. But the general belief of the Greeks is that Thales of Miletus got the army across. Starting from a point on the river upstream from the camp, he dug a deep, semicircular trench, so that the stream, turned from its ancient course, would flow in the trench to the rear of the camp, and passing it, would issue into its former bed, with the result that as soon as the river was thus divided in two, both channels could be forded, could be crossed. Okay. Does this really, this is the river today, right? Did this really happen? We don't know, right? But we know that Greeks were telling this story and they thought it was true. And so we know that Thales had a reputation for manipulating or engineering the natural world to solve problems, right? So he has special knowledge that other people don't have, right? Another point. Oh, by the way, you see the little lotus and another one there. I'm not going to mention them every time, but just draw your attention to it. By the way, I have to say something briefly about the Egyptians here before we talk about them in our upcoming module. Egypt was a lot older than ancient Greece. It's not even close, right? The Egyptians were older and more sophisticated, to the extent you can say that of a group of people, right? And so, because it's an older civilization, the Greeks have these stories of their wise figures spending time in Egypt. And it kind of puts a veneer on it. It sort of makes them fancy, right? Oh, yes, I went to Egypt. Yes, yes, right? It gives them some legitimacy and credibility. So, did he really go and spend time in Egypt with ancient Egyptian priests and stuff? Herodotus claims he did. Maybe he did. Okay, we don't know, but we know that this kind of gives Thales sort of reputability, a credibility, right? Well, this guy must know something. He went to a more sophisticated and older civilization and he studied there, right? Okay, so that concludes our bit there. Let's move on to the most crazy thing that's kind of associated with Thales, and it's this argument that everything is full of gods. Everything is full of gods. What is going on here? Famously, Thales says that everything is full of gods. It's all made of gods. What is he talking about? Remember, these are just fragments. So this comment does seem to conflict with this idea that the arche is water. But we just don't have enough information. Maybe he synthesized these. Maybe this is an early thought, a late thought. Maybe they're compatible. Maybe he didn't say that. We just don't know. But this claim and what Aristotle says about him is super important because people still make these kinds of errors in reasoning today. So let's talk about this. Thales, too, to judge from what is recorded about him, seems to have held soul to be a motive force, since he said that the magnet has a soul in it because it moves the iron. So, Thales observes a magnet, and he has to explain how those particles are moving around, right? This is Aristotle here chatting again. By means of the straight line, we know both itself and the curved, the carpenter's rulers enables us to test both. But what is curved does not enable us to distinguish itself or the straight. Certain thinkers say that the soul is intermingled with the whole universe. And it is perhaps for that reason that Thales came to the opinion that all things are full of gods. Gods. Okay, it's just a silly thing. All right, what's going on here? All right, Thales is going to get a stamp out of all of this, so don't feel bad about him, but we're going to go kind of hard on Thales here. All right. Thales sees some bits of iron or some bits of metal moving around with a magnet, and he's got to explain it, right? Well, he doesn't know what the electromagnetic spectrum is. I mean, he's no idea, and nobody will know for a long time. It's going to be millennia. So, he doesn't know. He says, it's the gods, right? There's some kind of invisible, he sees an invisible mechanism. He's just going to identify it with the gods. And he's going to say, oh, the gods do it. Now, you might think this is silly. Fair enough, but actually, people make this mistake frequently when they're reasoning and thinking about the world. A quick side note here, because this is going to impact your short answer question on your quiz. Remember that the Greeks don't see gods as independent of the universe in the same way that perhaps a modern Christian or someone from Islam might. In other words, people tend to think of the universe and then God is somehow outside of that universe. But for the Greeks, that wasn't true. The gods were all part of the universe. They were not outside of it, okay? So why does this matter? Well, it impacts our understanding of his explanation here. It used to be, right, someone heard thunder in the sky. They had no idea what that is, right? Electrostatic charge, physics, how does this work? We don't know. We just hear the thunder. What makes that thunder? I don't know. Thor, right? It's Thor up there with his hammer, right? Making this thunder. There's an earthquake. Look, plate tectonics weren't discovered till the late 60s, okay? Or in the 60s anyway. So they don't know that this is the movement of plates, right? Around the Earth's core and all this business. They don't have a clue. It wouldn't be around the core. There's a mantle. But the point is, they don't know what causes the earthquake, so they say it's Loki who causes this earthquake. It seems kind of ridiculous to us, but it's a tendency that all human minds have. Let me give you an example. There was a very famous case involving this very form of argument. Somebody, a guy named Michael Behe, looked at some bacteria under a microscope. And what he found, or, well, he knew it, but what he wondered was, how in the heck does a bacteria evolve a tail that lets it swim around, right? It just seems like this couldn't have been designed. I don't know how this could have been produced by a natural mechanism, right? I don't know how this would work. So God must have done it. And Behe articulates this argument that there are features of biological systems that are irreducibly complex, and because we can't explain how they would come about through natural mechanisms, we'd have to suppose a supernatural mechanism, and that would be God. Okay. But notice it's exactly the same move. What causes the bacteria to have this flagellum? I don't know what the natural mechanism is, so I'm going to then shove in a supernatural mechanism, right? Now, here with Thor, right? I don't know what causes the thunder, so I'm going to shove in a supernatural mechanism. The same thing happens. This happened in the 20th century, right? People see designs in nature, things that look like they're designed, and so they say, well, actually, that's not quite right. That's different. People see certain features of nature. They're unclear how those sorts of features could be produced in a natural system without someone designing them. So they say God must have done this, right? But this is actually a bad idea. And it was a bad idea for Behe to make this argument because it turns out it's well understood how the bacteria evolved that little tail. It's a complex story, but really, this argument, it's the same one that Thales makes, is what philosophers call an argument from ignorance. So it just means that you don't know how this works, you don't know what causes this, so you're going to say, right, I'm ignorant, so I'm going to go ahead and now say that the gods do it. But this is a tough road to take, and you have to be very careful. And there's a guy, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, a victim of the Nazis, who has a very good line on this. It's not as succinct as the next one, but it's pretty good. Here he goes. How wrong it is to use God as a stopgap for the incompleteness of our knowledge. If in fact the frontiers of knowledge are being pushed further and further back, and that is bound to be the case, then God is being pushed back with them and is therefore continually in retreat. We're to find God in what we know, not in what we don't know. Pretty nice defense. Even shorter, Charles Coulson says, either God is in the whole of nature with no gaps, or he's not there at all. And that's the worry, right? If when you encounter something you don't know or don't understand, you ascribe it to God. I don't know how this mechanism in nature works, whether it's thunder or a magnet or a bacterial flagellum. The moment that someone figures out that mechanism, what does that do to your faith, right? It's a dangerous game to play. And so philosophers call this a God of the gaps style argument. And the worry is that the basis of the argument is ignorance. And once that ignorance is removed, then it seems to make your explanation of God appear to be superfluous in addition to threatening your belief, right? So it's generally considered a bad type of argument. So in your quiz, you have one final short answer question. right? It basically says, was Thales the first god of the gaps argument? The best answers give me all these reasons. Ultimately, yes, Thales is in fact the first recorded instance we have of a god of the gaps style argument. He invokes a divine mechanism to explain how magnets work. That's just exactly what a god of the gaps argument is. And when people, having placed their faith in these gods, discover electromagnetism, it might jeopardize their belief in these gods. So if we brought Thales back today and we said, it's not actually Zeus pushing that metal around, it's all these electromagnetic bits or whatever's happening, right? He would be shocked and he'd be shook, right? He said, I thought it was Zeus, right? No, it's the electromagnetic spectrum, right? So this has happened many, many times in the history of the world. And so for that reason, it's considered a bad argument because the consequence seems to be then that the God you've put in place to do that work is totally superfluous. Well, as Bonhoeffer points out, as Coulson points out, look, it's either all God or none of it is, so you shouldn't just be isolating one part and say, oh, look, God serves as a proxy for the incompleteness of my understanding. Now, you might say no, that Thales doesn't make a God of the gaps argument here because he thinks that gods are part of the world, and so there's a way in which he's not appealing to the supernatural. But in the end, that may not matter anyway. This is the second point down here, because the gods are, he's attributing to the gods what is a natural mechanism. So there's a couple reasons for both. Just hit them lightly doesn't need to be a massive exam question. It's not. It's just a short answer. But that will constitute the best answer, those reasons. Okay, that does it. So you finished this video on Thales. You've got enough information to take that quiz. If you have any concerns, please never ever hesitate to contact me on Canvas messaging. It is my pleasure to help you through this course. I know online courses are tough, and I'd be happy to help. Okay, thanks. Peace.